Thank you, everyone, for joining us on another session of ACE Learns. My name is Elise Cogburn. I am Partnership Development Outreach Manager here for American Conservation Experience. And today we have a lovely guest, Sally Lent, ACE's own. She works as a Bee Lab support member with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I am so excited to chat with her and learn so much about bees. Even before the recording started, I already learned a few things, and I just can't wait to dive in. So thank you, Sally, so much for being here, and let's dive in.
All right. Thank you so much, Elise. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the work that I do, a little bit about bees. And before I get started, I wanted to say that all the bee photos used in this presentation were taken here at the USGS Bee Lab, which is where I'm physically located right now. And also wanted to point out that this bee that I used for my cover, you may have seen it before. There was this meme that went around a few years ago. This is actually how I learned about the lab in the first place through this meme. And this was a photo taken by the lab. So very exciting to be here. All right, I'm going to start off talking just a little bit about myself, my journey, and how I got here. Um, so I got my bachelor's and my master's both in environmental science, both from the University of Texas, San Antonio. I actually got started on bee work during my undergrad. I had, through a series of very weird coincidences and good luck, was able to do some undergraduate bee work, all because I was TAing for a professor who had a background in bee research and wanted to start up a program for undergrads at the time. And so through that research project, which was basically comparing data sets of iNaturalist and traditional survey field methods, um, through that project, that really was what awakened my interest in this field. And, the first time seeing a bee under a microscope and going like, dang, that is not what I thought a bee looked like. That is really what pulled me in. And I decided to continue with it. I went and got my master's at the same university and did another project on bees. This time I was looking at urban land use and how that affects bee populations in San Antonio. And when I was finishing up my master's, I started looking for, the next steps. And again, through a series of weird coincidences, I had just talked with my current supervisor, Claire Maffey, a few months before, just connecting to learn about her work in the field and, just to get to know her. And then a few months later, I saw this internship was posted for the Bee Lab. And so I applied, went for it, and now I'm here. And this is my third term with ACE. I started back in June 2023, and I hope to continue as long as I can. So before I talk about my work, I wanted to talk about why bees are important, why we do this work in the first place. Bees are often considered keystone species in most terrestrial ecosystems, and that is because they are the pollinators out there who are pollinating flowering plants that are important for both humans and wildlife. Bees are important because a third of the world's food crops require animal pollination, and that is mostly bee pollination. So things like apples, blueberries, pumpkins, zucchini, all of these crops need bees in order to produce their fruit. And even some crops that are self-pollinated, like coffee and corn, even though they don't technically need bees to produce those products, they benefit significantly in yield and quality from bee pollination. And then bees, of course, pollinate agricultural crops like alfalfa, which serve as animal feed. And so that also maintains our meat industry. Bees are important for plant reproduction and propagation. And then, this also leads to food for wildlife. But unfortunately, we've been seeing a widespread decline in many bee populations in recent decades. And there are the 5 major pressures that I'm going to talk about that are likely driving these declines. First is disease transmission. This is mostly from introduced and managed bee species. We mostly think about honeybees as a managed bee species, but there are also some bumblebee species that are used in order to pollinate crops. And so these commercial bees are moved around thousands and thousands of hives across state and country lines. And so these managed beehives may be introducing and increasing the prevalence of parasites and pathogens in wild bee populations and kind of like a spillover. Pesticides are often associated with agricultural fields, but they're also used in urban green spaces and private gardens. And the use of pesticides and their effects on pollinators can be a very controversial topic. It's something that is not necessarily well understood, but most recent discussions revolve around the use of neonicotinoid pesticides and their effects on bees. Then we also have changing weather patterns. And there's still a lot that we don't understand about this changing weather, but there are some effects that we would expect to see with the current data that we have and projections that exist. So there could be a decreased synchrony between bees and flowers, where some flowers bloom earlier and then their bees that pollinate them don't emerge at the same time, and that leads to this temporal mismatch. There can also be a spatial mismatch where plants or bees increase or decrease their ranges, and so they just no longer exist in the same spot anymore. And then, of course, increases in extreme weather events like floods, wildfires, droughts. These can all have immediate negative effects on bee populations. And then finally, land use changes associated with agricultural intensification and urbanization can also decrease the quality of habitat for bees. And so these pressures can all interact with each other in order to amplify their negative effect on bees. And we're basically seeing a death by 1,000 cuts happening. All right. So before I get into the meat of this presentation, I want to address honeybees. Honeybees are not native to North America. They are a domestic animal. They are an agricultural product. Honeybees were actually brought over from Europe sometime in the 1620s as a source of wax and honey. And so when we talk about saving the bees, we shouldn't really be including honeybees in those conversations. Too many C words in this field. Keeping honeybees to save the bees is like raising chickens to save the birds. They all have their place in the world, but chickens are not necessarily a good representation of our bird diversity. In the same way, keeping these honeybees, even though they are vital for agriculture and the economy, honeybees are not necessarily the best poster child for bee conservation. Since honeybees are an introduced species, everything from their biology to their life history and even their physical features are completely different from our native bees. So the strategies that we would employ in helping conserve honeybees may not necessarily help our native bees. So focusing on that one species leaves out the bigger picture of what's actually going on. All right. So I am physically located at the U.S. Geological Survey's Bee Lab, which is located at the Patuxent Research Refuge in Maryland. This lab was started by Sam Droege in USGS back in sometime in the early 2000s. And the lab itself doesn't actually do any research on bees, but it does support other researchers with their native bee projects. And fun fact, the Bee Lab is the only group in the Department of the Interior that has the expertise to identify native bees as species. The Bee Lab is comprised of two buildings, both pictured here. These are both part of the Bee Lab. Both buildings were originally used actually in the endangered crane breeding program, which started all the way back in 1967. These buildings were used to rear whooping cranes and sandhill cranes, and you can still see at that first building, you can see the pens where the cranes were kept. And actually in the second building, which is where I'm sitting at right now, you can see they still have the windows where there used to be doors that let out to pens for the chicks to come in and out. And we still have that like wonky floor because they needed to keep the floor clean. And so when you're walking, you just got to watch where you step. So this first building is our insect processing space. This is where we used to live up until last year when we moved into the second building, which is a new building. This is where we process all our specimens. This is also where we do some native plant work. We do still have those pens that I mentioned before. And so because everything is fenced and irrigated, we can actually grow plants and keep them safe from predation from deer. And it has a lot of character. I do miss working there, but it is nice having a real desk at this new space. In the past, USGS has engaged the local Friends of Patuxent group to encourage native plant conservation and pollinator habitat planning. So they've had like people come out to help collect seeds at the lab, at the compound to help us propagate more native plants. It's a cool space. This second building, which is where I'm at now, where we're all at, is the office and specimen repository space or insect library space. The back, which is where I'm at, is the office where we do all our, computer work, bee identification. And then the front end, which is what's pictured there, is where we hold all our specimens. And that's where our library is. Getting this space has been such a huge help because we're now able to actually store way more reference specimens, which really helps with our BID. Right now, we're sitting at about 1,500 species in the library, which there are 4,000 species in all of North America. So we're doing a good job there. Predominantly have species that are from the East. And in total, we have about 25,000 specimens or so. And all these specimens came in either through projects that went through the lab, donations from people, or through personal collections. And then in that first picture, you can see we have this very large walk-in freezer that's a little scary that we use to freeze our boxes in order to control pests in the collection. And yeah, right over here. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what being a Bee Lab support member actually is. I am part of 3 teams. The first one is a mouthful. I'm part of the National Resource Program Center's inventory monitoring branch. And within that branch, I'm part of the pollinator team, which is about 4 people. And so what we do there is we help provide support to refuges on their pollinator projects. And the National Resource Program Center is this interdisciplinary science team that helps inform planning and management decisions for refuges. The second team that I work very closely with is Center for Pollinator Conservation, which is a national center in the Fish and Wildlife Service that works collaboratively internally and externally with partners on pollinator conservation. There is a lot of crossover between these 2 teams, but the I&M pollinator team is more inward facing, looking at helping refuges, and the Center for Pollinator Conservation is more outward facing, engaging with partners. And then the last team is, of course, the USGS Bee Lab, just by virtue of being physically located here. We collaborate a lot with them, sharing standard operating procedures, giving each other advice on projects and project management. And then we also do a lot of outreach events together. So one of the main tasks that I'm in charge of is processing bees that were collected by refuges for their pollinator projects. Bees typically come into the lab as what we call wet bees, or basically insects sitting in alcohol. You can see an example of that on the left. Bees are typically collected in bowls that are filled with soapy water and set out for 24 hours, so they can get pretty nasty. And so they need to go through this process in order to make sure that they look good for identification. And that video is just showing a very sped up rundown of how we process the bees. And so processing means washing, drying, and then pinning the bees. This processing stage is very important because if the bees aren't washed properly, that can hinder a species level identification. You can see the photos at the bottom show a bee that was not processed properly. It looks gross, crusty. We call them goopy bees. And then to the right is that same bee after I gave it a second go. And you can see that there are colors that emerge that were not there previously. You can really see why it is important that we make sure that these are washed well. And you would think that bees are fragile and that they would not survive this process, but they are very sturdy. They do very well. They'll survive going through that dryer. We probably saw in the video we have a little dryer. It's a camping dryer that they just go through that and they come out beautiful and fluffy. So once those specimens have been processed, I then go through and get them at least a genus level, give them a good sort. Specimen identification is the bottleneck for any bee project. And that's just because there are very few people that can reliably and accurately identify bees to species. Um, and for fish and wildlife, that person is Claire. So my job is basically just to sort these bees and get them as well sorted and identified as I can in order to help Claire speed up her identification part. This is a skill that I've been working on. This is really what attracted me to the internship in the first place. I want to learn how to identify things to species, but it is a very difficult and finicky skill. There is a unfortunate lack of standardization in identification terms across the field. So, for example, when we describe color, sometimes one taxonomist may say this is orange, and another taxonomist may say actually that's red. And so that can be very difficult, especially for beginners in learning different species and going through those keys, actually understanding what they're supposed to be seeing. So one of the tasks that I have as I learn bee identification and I go through and I do my sorting is I take a photo of these characteristics using a camera I have attached to my microscope and basically to help provide a physical image of these characteristics that are being described in literature. So for example, I have this photo of a bee. We're looking at the abdomen, which is basically like the butt of the bee. And this species has what the literature calls spatulate hairs, which may not necessarily mean much to someone who's just starting in this field. Um, and when I was going through and I was trying to find these hairs, I was like, well, that kind of looks like it could be spatula, which just means the ends have these like are flattened. And it wasn't until Claire went and actually pulled up the character and showed it to me in the scope. I was like, oh, that's what that means. So I took this photo. You can see, especially in that first circle over here, you can really see bee hairs are very feathery. And so the spatula character just means that it has the feathery bits, but then at the very, very tip, it's flat. Um, it's a very pretty character. It actually looks a little shimmery when you look at it under the scope. And so taking these photos helps clear up those questions. These photos end up making their way to a website called Discover Life, which is a website that is heavily used and maintained by the Bee Lab. So a little bit of context, most bee identification keys are dichotomous, which just means that you have a set of paired choices that you go through and answer in order to identify what species you have. The problem with this is that you have to answer it in order and you have to be correct. Otherwise, you'll just end up somewhere completely off from where you want it to be. And as I mentioned before, those characters can be very difficult, especially when you're learning to actually understand what it's supposed to look like. So beginners can really struggle with this. So Discover Life, what they do is they actually take keys, these dichotomous keys, and present them in a matrix. And so instead of going through, in 1, 2, 3 order and answering one by one, you can actually go through and answer just the questions that you're sure about. And on the left side, it'll give you, all the species that have been keyed for in Discover Life. And as you go through and answer questions, that list will get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. So for example, here, if I went through and I clicked, okay, I'm pretty sure that I have a parasitic bumblebee, it'll knock that list from 142 down to just 6 species. And so what I do is I go through and for some of those characters that may be more difficult to understand, I can actually go in and put in a picture. So for example, here's a picture I took. This character is breaking up these 2 species, Bombus bifarius and Bombus fervidus. And the description is talking about an angle on the bumblebee leg. And if you're looking at the first species, Bombus bifarius, and it says, it's kind of rounded, you can look at it and you could almost trick yourself into thinking that that is a sharp angle. And it's not until you see the other species, Bombus fervidus, where you're like, oh, okay, that's what it means by sharp. And so for beginners who may not necessarily have a reference collection, they may not be able to make that distinction. And so that's why these photos are very important, um, especially if you don't have those reference specimens handy. So those photos that I take are not only used on Discover Life, but we also use them for outreach. These are some photos that I took for my thesis research using that scope camera. These are all bees that I collected for my thesis at my university, University of Texas San Antonio, which is a very urban campus. These are just 16 of the 28 genera that I collected at that university. You can see in this picture, the top left bee is a honeybee, which is the one that people are most familiar with. And you can compare that with all the other genera and species on here that are completely different looking from honeybees. You can start to understand why just talking about honeybees really does not capture that full picture about of bee conservation. And this is all the same bees, but now you can see their faces. Um, I think they're cute. I'm sorry your reaction, Elise. I'm sorry. I've looked at them enough that I think they're really, really cute. Um, but I find that this picture is very important. I talked about this in my thesis about, it's really hard to care for something and see the importance in something unless you can see them. And so I think when you go through and see these faces, even though they might be kind of spooky, especially that bottom, what is that? Bottom fourth bee is actually a parasitic bee, which parasitic bees are a whole world that people don't know about too. Um, there is a lot out there, and this is only a very, very small snapshot of everything that's out there. Okay, so with any insect or natural history collection, pest management is very, very important. I mentioned this before with the freezer, but you know, there are a lot of pests that we deal with, but the one that we deal with the most are dermestids, which that video is showing a dermestid larva. They are our main concern because they cause a lot of destruction to our specimens. That bee shown on the left, that green bee, you can see there's a lot of damage to the eyes. And I do want to point out that these are only a problem to the dead insects. They will not go for live things. But you can see when that video rolls around again that they get really deep in there. They're kind of nasty. The adults, which are the adult is that beetle down there, they're pollen feeders. We're not so much worried about those apart from them laying their eggs. Really, when we talk about pest management, it's managing for that larva and for the eggs because they're very resistant to cold temperatures. So to control for these dermestids, what we do is we gather all our boxes up every 6 or so weeks, and we leave them all in our deep freezer, which is set to about -10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the boxes stay in there for about 24 to 48 hours. And just keeping up that freezing cycle seems to manage for the dermestids pretty well. We only see every once in a while now. Um, yeah, getting this video was very exciting, if not gross, because we very rarely see them alive. We usually only find them dead, like in that photo at the bottom left. Um, you'll almost never see a live one. Usually they're just very deep in the bee. But you can tell if you have a dermestid issue because you'll see below your bee, there'll be like brown dirt or soil. That's basically their frass or their poop. They'll be like in there eating and pooping, and so you'll be able to tell that you have that issue. But yeah, very exciting to get this video. And he's no longer with us, unfortunately. Um, One of the resources that we are able to offer National Wildlife Refuges is we actually can support technicians, and we do technician training. So we have previously hosted other ACE interns who were working at Arkansas and Kentucky refuges. They came in and we taught them how to process their specimens that they collected out in the field, and then also gave them a very quick rundown of bee identification, and they were actually able to sort their specimens to pretty good morpho species, which was a really big help for us, and I think a pretty cool experience for them. And they also helped us create some training videos on processing specimens, which are still used by these ACE interns today. So we're still working with this project. They're based in the Southeast. And we expect to actually have this year's ACE interns twice this year. We'll have them in April and November for preseason and postseason training. Um, and real quick, the photo in this slide is one of the species that they collected, Melatomatoria, which is a very, very cool species. I don't think you can see it in that photo, but they have a super long tongue that even when they fold it up, reaches all the way back to their abdomen. They're specialists on bindweed and morning glory, which are very like tubular flowers, which you can see why they need those long tongues to get in there. And they're also called chimney bees because they build these really cool mud towers outside of their nests so that they can basically find it again. Um, I think they're cute, but I think all bees are cute, so I'm a little biased there. Something that wasn't in my original job description, but that I had an interest in and a background in was creating communication products for the teams that I work with. I've created a whole bunch of different stuff. Probably the most impactful was I've created annual reports for National Wildlife Refuge pollinator projects. And this has been very well received. It really got a lot of refuge work in front of a lot of leadership, got people talking. So we were able to elevate people's work um, to higher channels. And that was very, very cool. I've also created one-pagers for refuges to help their staff, help inform them on their pollinator survey planning. And then what I have the most fun with is just making fun products for the lab to help with our outreach events. I've made, business card, posters. I made a whole series of album covers that are all bee related. I have a lot of fun with that. And then finally, one of my favorite parts of my job, other than the bee identification, is actually the outreach. Um, I've gone and done stuff all the way from like summer camps and nature walks to one of my favorite events, which was the Philly Flower Show. The lab was invited to go out and um, have an exhibit at this flower show back in 2024. And so what we did for that was we printed the lab photos on lucite so they could be backlit. And then we just talked about bees for 11 to 12 days. And the flower show had about 250,000 visitors, I think, which definitely felt like that. I had such a sore throat by the end of it. But we had such a great time, talked to so many people, and reached audiences that we never would have reached at the usual outreach events that we usually do. So finally, I'm going to talk a bit about how to help. I've talked about why this is important. I think it's only right to talk about what we can do to help bees. So to start with, there are 4,000 species of bees in North America. And so we need to start thinking about how we will change our conservation efforts to help these species instead of thinking about honeybees, because again, they have a very different life cycle and biology and everything. Um, and you might be surprised about what's out there. There is a huge range in sizes. There's all the way up from carpenter bees, which are, I mentioned this before, they're like the dogs of the bee world. They just love to get in your face and they're not being aggressive. They're just trying to figure out who you are. They're about the size of a quarter. That's the biggest that we get. And then all the way down to our smallest bee in North America, which is Perdita minima, which is about the size of like the lettering on the quarter. Huge range in sizes. So when you go out to your garden to look at, are your pollinator habitat efforts working? Look for the little things too. And also want to talk about stings because I find that when I talk about encouraging people to plant for bees, I often get questions and concerns about stings, and that is a totally valid and understandable concern to have. So what I have to say about this is you really don't need to worry too much about stings when attracting bees. First of all, what are stingers? Stingers are modified egg-laying organs, so only the females will have stingers. And solitary bees, like this bee on the right, they really are going to very, very, very rarely sting. And most of them don't even have, or some of them, um, don't even have stingers that can penetrate human skin. Think about the bee on the previous slide. She's about 2 millimeters big. Her stinger is not going to do anything to you. Much of what people know about bee stings are based on honeybees, and that's because they are the most encountered and also most aggressive bee species in North America. If you look closely at that bee sting on the left, that is a honeybee stinger. They have barbs on their stings, and so when they sting you, stinger goes into your skin, they pull out, that stinger stays in there, and the honeybee will die because her basically everything in there is going to get pulled out. But most importantly, the venom sac is going to stay attached, and so that venom sac can keep pumping venom into you even after the bee has left. This is contrasted with our solitary bees. So if you look on the right, that solitary bee stinger, same with all other bees in North America, is straight. There is no barbs. That does mean that they can sting multiple times, but solitary bee venom is very, very, very much less toxic or venomous than honeybee venom. So you really don't need to worry. I mean, still go to the doctor if you have a reaction, of course, but you are not likely to, first of all, even get stung by a solitary bee because it's just one mama. And I'll talk about this more a bit later, but it is just one mama building her nest, taking care of her kids. She is not interested in what you have to do with her, other than, if you actually get in there and try stomping on her nest, then she might have a problem with that. But she's most likely just going to move away. Because if she dies, that's it for her. There's no other workers that can take on her work. Um, if you ever if you ever have had an encounter with a stinging insect, and where you got stung multiple times or you got swarmed, um, it was probably a wasp. There are some wasps that live underground, like yellow jackets. Yellow jackets work by, they're in a colony. If you come close, they'll release a pheromone, and that basically signals all the other wasps that they're being attacked and, go and defend the colony. And so, um, solitary bees don't have that. It is, like I said, just one bee taking care of her kids, and so she will not let out a pheromone that'll let other bees know to attack. But I will make a case for yellow jacket wasps. They are still important. They also pollinate. They also hunt pest insects. So we may not like them, but they have their place and they deserve our respect and conservation efforts. They're just friends that need a little more space. So to help bees, we have to think about what their needs are. And I'll talk about each need in more detail in a bit. First, they need nesting sites. We usually think about honeybee hives when we think about bee nests, but really less than 1% of bees actually build hives. Bees also need overwintering sites. So most bees will just overwinter as eggs or larvae or pupa wherever they are laid in their nesting sites. But there are some bees that overwinter as adults, for example, bumblebees. And so those bees will need overwintering sites that are protected from disturbance. And then, of course, bees need pollen and nectar for nutrition. They need pollen for protein and nectar for carbohydrates, not just for themselves, but also for their babies. Honeybees make honey, and that is what they use to feed themselves and their babies. But solitary bees make something called bee bread, which is basically just pollen and nectar smushed up into what looks like a little bread loaf, and then they'll lay their egg in that, or on top of that bee bread, and that will be the baby's food when they are born. So let's talk nesting needs. 70% of native bees are ground nesting. They lay their eggs in these burrows that they dig out. And so these bees really need access to bare soil. So things like thick layers of mulch, lawn, and impervious surfaces are all going to reduce the availability of nesting habitat for these bees. And the best way to help these bees is to basically pick an area in your garden that is not going to be disturbed, and just leave it open. Just leave it kind of messy, and that'll really encourage bees to go in and nest there. 30% of our bees are cavity nesters. Instead of digging a hole in the dirt, these bees are going to instead look for an existing cavity. For example, old beetle holes in dead wood, or they'll also look for like hollow stems or pithy stems. And then this is the group of bees that would be attracted to bee hotels if you have a bee hotel. So to help cavity nesters, just basically leave your dead trees or your snags in your garden. Um, Not just bees, but other insects will also use that as habitat. Or you could also get plants with pithy stems like raspberries or a lot of rose bushes too. Um, and then bee hotels are also going to be used by these cavity nesters. But what I have to say about that is you do need to commit to replacing that every couple years or so. Otherwise, it just becomes a sink for pests and stuff that are going to hurt the baby bees in there. So ultimately, bee hotels are more if you want to observe bees, they're more for humans than they are for bees. If you really want to help these cavity nesters, it is better to just leave some dead wood in your garden. That'll be way better for them than a bee hotel. And then finally, we have our hive building um, bees, which are less than 1% of bee species. So you can see just from this pie chart that really our focus needs to move away from those honeybees more to these ground nesters that are 70% of our bee species. Um, and then for overwintering sites, you really don't need to do anything additional if you're already um, you know, taking steps to provide bee nesting sites for your bees, then you don't need to do anything additional other than maybe leaving some leaf litter because some of those bumblebees will look for those places to kind of burrow. Or if you do need to move your leaf litter, move it somewhere else on your property, but then, don't throw it away. Just leave it there until the next season. And ultimately, the best way to help bees is just leave your garden a bit messy. Don't cut things down. Don't throw things away. They like it. They like it like that. So for the food needs, the best way to provide food for native bees is to plant native plants. Many of these bees have co-evolved with their preferred host plants over thousands of years, and so they might not actually recognize or use the ornamentals or non-native plants you may have in your garden. That doesn't mean you can't have any non-native plants, though. The National Wildlife Federation recommends at least 70% of your garden be native, so you do still have that like 30% wiggle room to grow stuff that fills your soul. And I will put a plug there for Pollinator Partnership. I'm going to talk about a couple of their resources. Pollinator Partnership is the largest nonprofit in the world that is dedicated exclusively to pollinator protection and conservation. They have a ton of resources on their website. And I'm going to talk about these two, which this first one is their garden cards. And I have a QR code there if you wanted to go look at them. These are basically a quick little reference guide for people to start thinking about pollinator gardens. And this is mostly designed for smaller spaces, but they do have one for every region. So if you wanted to start maybe considering getting a pollinator garden, this is a great place to start. And their second resource that is also super awesome is their Find Their Roots tool, which is similar, but basically you can go in, actually put in your zip code, and then filter by like what sort of plant characteristics you want. Like, do I want tall plants or really short plants or that sort of thing? You can put in those filters and it'll generate a list of recommendations for you to actually go in and make your pollinator garden. But really what you want to do is just plan to have native plants blooming throughout the year to provide food resources for bees all season long. Which doesn't mean that you only want to have, herbaceous plants, because trees are actually an extremely important resource for bees too. Trees are actually usually one of the first plants to bloom in the spring. And so they provide a lot of very important foraging resources for those early spring bee species and bumblebee queens. So, you don't have to just think small. You can also think tree size big. And there's another QR code there if you wanted to try that tool out. And that's all I have. I have a QR code there for the lab's Flickr website, and I will take questions. But if you had any more questions, or you wanted links to our training videos, or anything else, or just wanted to ask more questions about bees, I am available. That is my email. I am always down to talk about bees.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Sally. I'm just here like feverishly taking notes on bees. Like I was telling her earlier, I'm very allergic to bees, and I think it's honeybees. I think those little buggers, because
Mm-hmm.
what I've learned in this presentation is that there's some bee propaganda going on around honeybees, and
There
I
is bee propaganda.
gotta switch
Yes.
that up, switch it up.
Big bee.
That this was so informative. Thank you so much. There's one chat or there's one question here in the chat. We'll start off with, and then any other folks have questions, they can kind of lead after that. Allison asked, how do you set up a bee nesting opportunity that will house native bee species, but not the honeybee? So how do we keep the honeybees out of the home meant for the native bee species?
So honeybees have a very different nesting style to most of our other native bees, right? They build hives. And so, our native bees would not really colonize a honeybee hive, and the other way around. Our honeybees are not really going to take over like a ground nesting bee nest or a cavity nesting bee nest. Like you won't see them in a bee hotel ever, except maybe sniffing around if they're curious. So that is really not a concern.
Okay. Quick follow-up question to that. Is there,
Yes.
for my own selfish speaking, are there specific, and I'm sure I could probably find it on the pollinator partnership resource. Thank you for sharing that, by the way. I'm going to definitely check that out. If there's like some species of plants that are preferred to native bees rather than like honeybees, if like there's plant or specific flowers or plants that attract them, or it's like one for all for one, we just got to try and kick the honeybees out. Now I'm like
Uh,
anti-honey.
Unfortunately, you're not gonna get rid of the honeybees. The honeybees, they are an agricultural product, but there are, of course, um, many populations that have escaped and become feral. You're not gonna ever be able to like deter them.
Yeah.
Honeybees are also generalists, so they will pretty much just go for anything. Um, Honeybees actually do this really cool thing called nectar robbing, where if they can't reach the nectar, the pollen through traditional means, they'll just go around and nibble a hole,
What?
and just steal the nectar. So
And now
there
they're
isn't
robbers? Oh my gosh. All right. All right. All right.
um,
That's
yeah, so they'll pretty much go for any plant, so there's no deterring the honeybees. Um, as for native bees or solitary bees, that depends. It is a case by case basis. There are a lot of specialists that may only prefer like one species or genus of plants. Um, and so there isn't really like one plant that will help all of them. It's really just like as much variety as you can provide. Um, will be the best solution there.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Uh, we've got one other question populating in the chat from Elsa. Hi, Sally. More personal question from one pollinator focused grad student to another. Where do you see yourself post ACE internship and grad school?
I hope here. I would love to stick around in the Bee Lab as much as possible. Um, but I am trying to find my space. I think I do love the education side of pollinator work. I love the science side. Um, so anywhere where I can do that, I can keep up with a little bit of like a jack of all trades job, I think.
That's awesome. Any other questions for Sally from the audience? Feel free to unmute yourself or go ahead and mention in the chat. We've got another question here from Kat. Other than flowers, would you recommend growing herbs or vegetables in a garden for bees?
Absolutely. I mean, let me think. There are so many vegetables that need bee pollination. There's stuff like, I guess tomatoes, you could technically call them a vegetable. Tomatoes require buzz pollination, so stuff like bumblebees and carpenter bees. basically they're so big that when they latch onto this plant and like vibrate, that helps release the pollen from the plant. Because some of these
Uh,
plants, like tomatoes and I think other squashes, their pollen is packed so tightly in there that bees that don't do buzz pollination would not be able to access it. And herbs are a great thing for bees. I've seen so many bees on stuff like mints. They really love their mints. As long as, like I said, you keep that 70 to 30% ratio, you can help both bees and yourself.
that's awesome. As I'm planning out my garden, I'm like, oh, this is good. This is good information. Thank you. Any other questions for Sally? I also just want to echo a comment that was made in the chat around your graphic design skills. I loved how every single slide, like in the corner, you had like a little bee popping up, but then in like the small writing, you actually had like this, like the species and genus of what that bee, like who that bee was. I thought,
Yeah. I we have the lab has so many photos, it would be criminal not to use them.
yeah.
Actually, I can talk a little bit about this guy on this slide. This is a cuckoo bee, which I mentioned before, which are parasitic bees. So you don't usually think of bees being
Yeah.
parasitic, but I think it's somewhere around 20% of, like, if you count up all your bees, about 20% of them are parasites. And so what these guys will do is they have their preferred host bee and they're going to follow them around until they find their nest. And once that mom's gone, they're going to sneak in, kill the egg, and then lay their egg instead, and take over that nest.
Whoa.
So there is some drama in the bee world.
Just a little. Dang. It's like Bravo drama. Okay.
Hmm.
We've got one other question from Emma here. Do you have a favorite species of bee or a
Oh,
more or most underrated or unique bee species? Lots
that
of fun.
is that is such a difficult question. Uh, I think I really like there's a genus called Perdita that's they call them the fairy bees. They're very, very tiny. And you would think that they're very cute, but when you zoom in, they're kind of hug huggish. They've got kind of like a squashed face. And I really love that. They come in such pretty colors. They're so, so tiny. And I haven't seen them that frequently. They're not that common.
Yeah. Yeah, I was honestly very surprised at the slide where you had all of the bee, guess the bee faces definitely terrified me at first. But colors of the bees, like there were like iridescent blues and greens, and a normal person, non-bee expert, would just think that was just like another insect or bug or not even, think twice about it. But
Yeah.
to really focus like, oh, like that could be a bee. I'd be a little bit,
Right. Yeah, there's one of our most common bees are actually the green bees or the sweat bees. And they're called sweat bees because they like to land on you and lick up your sweat. But they look a lot like flies to the untrained eye. And so um, if you ever go out there and you're looking at flowers and you see a flash of green, just it's not necessarily a fly. It could be a bee.
that's so cool. I learned so much in this. Thank you again, Sally, so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you so
Ooh.
much for inviting me.
Okay, there's one last question that we got in the chat that I
Okay.
actually would love a little clarification on. So Shannon wrote, I think you mentioned having about 2,500 species in the collections at the lab, but are those of individual species or just total bees?
So yes, it was 1,500 species, and that is unique species, not just individuals. So we have about 25,000 individuals of all different species, but 1,500 species. And that is
Wow.
mostly eastern bees. So if you look at like a map of species, you'll see that the east has a lower bee diversity or lower species counts. And then as you move out west, they become more diverse because there's more unique habitat. Like if you actually look at the southwest where there's like deserts, that is actually a bee diversity hotspot because there are so many unique plants there, that there's a bunch of bee species that had to co-evolve with those plants to pollinate them. You wouldn't think of deserts being a hotspot for bees.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's so cool. That's so cool. Any last minute questions for our presenter? Speak now and save the bees. Awesome. I think that's it. We've got her contact information on the screen. If you have any questions, please. I have a feeling that Sally would love to talk about bees all day, every day with anybody who would love to. I honestly have some more questions, but this was such a fantastic presentation, so informative. Great presentation, great slides. Thank you so much, Sally, for taking the time this afternoon to chat with us. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. And like, I love talking about bees. My friends are tired of hearing about them, so I'm always happy to talk about them with anyone who has questions.